War of Annihilation. Today is October 4th. You're on Andrei Illarionov's channel. I would like to bring to your attention 20 theses about what's currently happening in the Iran-Israel war. First, a few comments regarding the Iranian missile attack, and then more general observations, remarks, and conclusions about this war. First, a few comments regarding the Iranian missile attack, and then more general observations, remarks, and conclusions about this war. So, the first thesis, the Iranian missile attack on Israel on October 1st. Apparently, Iran launched around 200 ballistic missiles at Israel, with 181 missiles reaching Israeli territory or airspace. The targets of the airstrike were the Mossad headquarters, as well as military air bases in Tel Tov, Katsarim, and Nevatim. In Nevatim, no fewer than 30 strikes by these missiles were recorded. What are the results of this raid? 7 people were killed. 1 immigrant from Gaza who was visiting Jericho in an Arab settlement. 1 person died in Jordan. 5 people were killed during the launch of the missile in Iran. In total, 7 people were killed, all Muslims. No one was killed in Israel. There is only some destruction. Apparently, the destruction is minor. Damage was caused to administrative buildings at several military air bases. There are no destroyed planes or serious military assets. However, literally on the eve of this raid, 2 terrorists who got off a tram in Jaffa carried out an attack on Israelis and killed 7 people, and 1 more person, a resident of Georgia, died a few hours later. 16 people were injured. As a result, it turns out that 181 ballistic missiles did not kill anyone on Israeli territory, but killed 7 people in other places, and 2 terrorists who found themselves on Israeli territory killed 8 people. So, there's something to think about when it comes to modern asymmetric warfare. The second conclusion that can be drawn is the significance of missile weapons at this time. Despite what seems like a low effectiveness of this missile strike, we know that such missile strikes have been carried out recently and will continue to be carried out at Israeli territory from Gaza, Lebanon, Yemen, and Iran. Similar strikes are being carried out by Israelis on Lebanese, Syrian, and Iranian territories. The most notable ones are the strikes on Hezbollah's headquarters in Beirut, or the Yemeni port of Hodeidah. It's hard to imagine a more convincing lesson about the significance of missile weapons and anti-missile defense for Ukraine. That same Ukraine, which not long ago had a powerful scientific base for creating and producing various missiles. The loss of this school, this base, is having serious consequences in bloodshed among both Ukrainian military personnel and civilians. Once again, it's necessary to recall the classic work by Generals Zaluzhny and Zabrodsky about the current real center of gravity in the Russian-Ukrainian war. This is the availability of long-range missiles in Ukraine. We also need to remember those requests, complaints, and appeals by Putin to the United States and the West not to provide Ukraine with long-range missiles, not to deploy them on Ukrainian territory, and not to allow Ukraine to use these long-range missiles to strike military targets in Russia. We must recall the promise made by President Biden during a phone conversation with Putin on December 30th, 2021, when he promised Putin not to provide Ukraine with long-range missiles, which is exactly what Putin had asked for. We understand that, apparently, this promise by Biden, along with other actions by Biden and his administration, played the role of a green light, a positive signal for Russia to launch a large-scale aggression against Ukraine less than 2 months later. An important conclusion for Ukraine is that without its own production of long-range missiles that can cover most of the aggressor's territory, it will be extremely difficult, almost impossible, to stop the invasion and liberate occupied Ukrainian territories from the aggressor. The third conclusion, a warning of Iran. This story is particularly interesting because Iran had warned both the United States and Russia in advance about its strikes at Israel. Some observers even note that maybe Iran shared the targets of its strikes with the United States or Russia. Thus, now not only regarding the Russian-Ukrainian war, but also regarding part of the Iran-Israel war, new rules of war are beginning to apply, which seemed not to exist before. This is a new class of wars, coordinated wars, wars that involve informing sides, warning sides, indicating targets, and preparing for evacuation, etc. This phenomenon did not exist before. The fourth conclusion, Israel's response. It is inevitable. Everyone talks about it. The Israeli authorities have stated it. What will these strikes be? What kind of response will it be? Currently, there is a wide discussion about the possible targets that Israelis might strike. Among them are obvious targets such as command centers in Iran, objects related to nuclear and missile production, energy infrastructure, oil terminals on Karg Island, the Kengan gas plant, and the port of Bandar Abbas. All this is important, but to understand better potential targets, it is necessary to comprehend the nature of this war. And here we come to a series of most important conclusions about the nature of this war. The fifth thesis. So, this is not the third Lebanese war, nor the fifth Gaza war, nor the fourth Syrian war. This war is not against Arabs at all. This is Israel's first war against Persians, or more precisely, against the Iranian regime of Ayatollahs. It is necessary to understand that from the Iran side, which started this war, it is a total war of annihilation of Israel and its population. This is not an exchange of strikes. It is a harsh, ideologically motivated war of annihilation of the entire Israeli population. As a result of this war, one of the participants will cease to exist, either the state of Israel or the Iranian regime of Ayatollahs. There will be no intermediate option. The sixth thesis. When did preparations for this war begin? The Iranian regime of Ayatollahs started preparing for this war in 1979, shortly after the victory of the so-called Islamic Revolution. At that time, the goal of total annihilation of Israel and its population was proclaimed. To achieve this, Iran created new armed forces, launched a missile program, launched a nuclear program, and established a powerful international network of proxies, trusted persons, groups, divisions, and army units to attack Israel from different sides. The nuclear program plays a particularly important role in Iran's preparations for total war against Israel and the destruction of this state entity. This nuclear program has many different stories, and it deserves a separate conversation, but today I would like to stop at one point. This is the seventh thesis, the relationship between different US administrations and Iran's nuclear program. Perhaps the most significant part played by the United States was the negotiations conducted with Iran by representatives of the Obama administration. The goal of these negotiations was to allow the Iranian regime to continue its uranium enrichment work. During 6 rounds of these negotiations, an agreement was reached in 2015 that allowed Iran to continue this work. On the American side, the main negotiators were close friend and ally of Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, former Secretary of State John Kerry. This is the same Kerry who literally a few days ago stated that the biggest problem for him and his Democratic Party right now is the existence of the First Amendment to the US Constitution, which guarantees freedom of speech, and he called for its abolition and the establishment of total censorship. At the time, the negotiating team included then State Department employees such as current CIA Director Bill Burns, current National Security Advisor to President Biden, Jake Sullivan, and current National Security Advisor to Vice President Harris, Phil Gordon. The signing of this agreement is considered a major achievement by Obama, Biden, Harris, and naturally, all participants in these negotiations who achieved the signing of this agreement. President Trump, who succeeded Obama, announced in 2018 that the United States would withdraw from this agreement. Moreover, he imposed additional sanctions on Iran. When the Biden administration came to power in 2021, it resumed negotiations and lifted a significant portion of the sanctions imposed by the Trump administration. As a result, Iran received at least $10 billion from frozen funds, and according to Vice Presidential candidate J.D. Vance's recent debate statement, the amount received is as high as $100 billion. However, Vance may be counting all funds received during both Biden's and Obama's terms. The eighth thesis. What are the results of Biden's policy towards the Iranian Ayatollah regime? Lifting sanctions on Iran by Biden led to a predictable and expected outcome. In 2020, at the end of Trump's term, Iran's GDP was $196 billion. Currently, in 2024, 4 years later, Iran's GDP is expected to reach $464 billion. This means an increase of 2 4/10 times. This is a record GDP growth rate and correspondingly a record growth rate of financial, economic, and military capabilities of the Iranian regime. This is what Trump repeatedly talked about during his presidential campaign. Trump limited the military capabilities of the Iranian regime, while Biden pumped Iran with financial resources, which the terrorist Ayatollah regime uses to develop and produce various types of weapons, including nuclear weapons, as well as to finance pro-Iranian groups throughout the Middle East aimed at destroying Israel. The ninth thesis. When did the Iran-Israel war begin? It didn't start on October 1st this year. This can be said to be already the second phase of a direct Iran-Israel war. It wasn't started even on April 14th of this year, when Iran launched its first rocket attack on Israeli territory. We dedicated a special video to this topic on our channel. This war was actually started on October 7th, 2023, almost a year ago, with an attack by Hamas on Israeli territory. Gaza became the first front in this large-scale Iran-Israel war. The next day, on October 8th, 2023, Iran opened a second front against Israel by sending Hezbollah fighters to attack Israel. A few days later, on October 19th, 2023, Iran brought Houthi rebels into the fray, and they launched rocket attacks on Israel and maritime shipping in the Red Sea, opening a third front against Israel and the West. Fighting also broke out, albeit not on the same scale, on the Syrian front, the Iraqi front, and in the so-called territories, or Judea and Samaria, as well as within Israel itself. For example, the terrorist attack on Israeli citizens on October 1st was just another such an incident. Thus, by April 14th of this year, there were already 7 fronts. On April 14th, an 8th front was added to the large-scale Iran-Israel war, a war aimed at destruction Israel. The 10th thesis. Regional breakdown of the war. Actually, listing all these proxy units gives us a list of those 7, now 8 fronts in the large-scale Iran-Israel war. Gaza, Judea and Samaria, directly Israel itself, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Houthis in Yemen, the Assad regime in Syria, Shia militias in Iraq, and directly Iran itself. The 11th thesis. Why did Iran start its war to destroy Israel not earlier or later, but specifically on October 7th, 2023? It had been preparing for this war for almost 45 years. Why didn't it happen earlier? Why didn't they postpone the start of this war to a later date? For now, we can't say that we know everything, but the declaration of a large-scale war of the Global South against Western civilization was announced by Russian President Vladimir Putin at a meeting of the Valdai Club on October 5th, 2023, just 36 hours prior the start of the first shots in the large-scale Iran-Israeli war and Hamas's attack on Israeli territory. As is well known, on the eve of October 7th, Russian military delegations visited both Tehran and Beirut. The Russian private military company Wagner participated in training Hamas fighters. A Russian reconnaissance satellite changed its orbit 2 weeks before October 7th. Now, during military operations in southern Lebanon, Israelis are finding Russian military equipment among Hezbollah fighters. Israeli aviation has just bombed a warehouse of weapons either on the Russian base at Khmeimim or near it. The warehouse contained Iranian rockets recently delivered from Iran for use against Israel. All these factors suggest that Iran began its total war against Israel, which it had been preparing for almost 45 years, only after receiving understanding or agreement or a direct green light from the Kremlin. The 12th thesis, Israel's response. Obviously, there will be a response from Israel. It is inevitable. What can this response be? What should it be? What is expected of this response? Now, Israel faces a not-so-simple task, considering all aspects: territories, distances, deployment, and most importantly, the mortal danger posed by the Iranian regime to Israel. Therefore, Israel's response will not be just an exchange of strikes. Such a response will not aim at getting a noisy result. The goal of the first and subsequent strikes, as well as the entire war, will be the destruction of the Ayatollah regime. An ideal scenario would be to conduct a surgical operation to change the Ayatollah regime in Iran and bring about new power that can restore traditional historical, if not allied, then friendly relations between the two nations, which existed for over 2,500 years. However, the key factor in determining the timing of strikes against Iran and the launch of a large-scale offensive by Israel is the presidential elections in the United States. If Israel's assessment is that these Israeli strikes could influence the outcome of the November 5th elections in favor of Harris, it is likely that these strikes will be postponed until after November 5th. We know that Mrs. Harris is a very persistent anti-Israel figure, and her vice president does not hide his intentions and positions as an anti-Semite. 13th thesis. What possible response can Iran have? Apart from purely military actions, Iran may resort to three strategic responses. The first and most important one, try to involve the United States, both the current administration and any future administration, in this conflict on their side, to use the United States to pressure Israel into a so-called ceasefire. Iran can try to blackmail the United States with potential strikes against the energy infrastructure of Arab Sunni states in the Persian Gulf region, thereby provoking a serious energy crisis. Second, Iran can try to rally Iranians around the regime by attacking not only oil, gas, and energy facilities, but also sparking a war against Sunni states that would be perceived as a religious Shia-Sunni conflict. In this case, Arab states that currently maintain neutrality or non-participation in this war may find themselves in a difficult situation. And finally, the third direction of action by the Iranian regime can be to provoke ethnic conflicts within Iran itself, with the aim of creating among Iranians the impression that, in order to avoid a bloody internal civil war of an ethnic nature, it is better for them to rally around the very regime. 14th thesis. What are the consequences of this war for Ukraine? I have already spoken 6 months ago about how, with the start of the Iran-Israel war, in a conventional war against Russian aggression, Ukraine would receive its first exceptionally important, strong, powerful, intelligent, and energetic ally. Ukraine's acquisition of such an ally could lead to three possible scenarios. The first, minimum, diversion of Iranian resources for the war with Israel, and accordingly, a decrease in assistance from Iran to Russia in terms of receiving rockets, drones, and other resources from Iran. Second, as the next level of development, formation of a common front of victims of aggression against countries of the aggression axis, i.e., Russia, Iran, North Korea, Belarus. A coalition would be formed between Ukraine and Israel until new fronts and allies would emerge in this global war. At most, the formation of such an alliance could lead to achieving a common goal, destruction of the respective regimes both in Iran and Russia. Today, Ukraine greatly lacks a true ally on the battlefield. Israel represents an ideal candidate for such a real ally and partner. Moreover, in today's situation, it is not less but possibly even more useful and more effective than the United States. 15th thesis. What is the real policy of Ukraine's government towards Israel? The answer, disappointing. The Ukrainian government consistently pursues an anti-Israeli policy, thus destroying the possibility of forming an alliance between two victims of aggressions. The Ukrainian government regularly votes for almost all anti-Israel resolutions in the UN. Ukraine demands to the creation of a so-called Palestinian state, this tool for anti-Israel terrorist organizations and their convenient shelter after terrorist attacks. At the last session of the UN General Assembly, during Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's speech, arguably the most outstanding statesman in the world over the past 15 years, the Ukrainian delegation left the hall. Why? On whose absurd instruction did they do this? The anti-Israeli position of Ukraine's government is not only shameful, but also evidence of appalling incompetence in both foreign and defense policy, as well as overall policy towards countering aggression against Ukraine. 16th thesis, the weakness of the United States. Both the beginning and continuation of the Iran-Israel war have demonstrated the horrific weakness of the current United States. Understanding what strong United States is and how necessary it is to the world comes precisely when the US is weakened and is stopped performing its functions as an international police force. It is then that ruthless wars by all sorts of bandits against peaceful citizens and peaceful states begin, and whose victims become both weak and defenseless. 17th thesis: the role of Biden and his administration. It is unique in terms of unleashing new wars and creating new military catastrophes. We have seen this regularly throughout all 4 years of the Biden presidency. The shameful withdrawal of American troops from Afghanistan in August 2021, the green light for a large-scale invasion by Putin's forces into Ukraine in February 2022. This aggression has been prolonged due to Biden's refusal to supply necessary arms to defend Ukraine, blocking aid to Ukraine for many months by Biden and his administration, and providing colossal economic assistance to the Putin regime, totaling over $500 billion in additional revenue for Putin's budget to wage war against Ukraine. In addition, what happened during Biden's presidency in Africa is a series of military coups in Mali, Guinea, Burkina Faso, Niger, genocide in Sudan, Nigeria. All this took place with the full tolerance and permission of the Biden administration to carry out these actions. Some of them were conducted under the flag of fighting global terrorism, with the participation of Russian PMC Wagner units and other assistance from Putin's regime. Of course, a special place is occupied by the beginning of the global Iran-Israel war on October 7th, 2023, on all fronts. Another front is the invasion at the southern border of the United States. 18th thesis: the Biden administration has demonstrated not only its incredible weakness, but also its even more horrific incompetence. At the beginning of 2021, when CIA Director Burns took office, he published the priorities of his agency for American intelligence for the next 4 years. He then repeatedly repeated this list of priorities during his public speeches. Not once throughout all this time did he mention any problem that actually occurred over these 4 years, neither Afghanistan, nor Ukraine, nor Africa, nor the Middle East. One cannot also fail to mention Jake Sullivan, Biden's assistant on foreign policy activity, who exactly 1 week before October 7, 2023, published an article in Foreign Affairs magazine stating that the Middle East was experiencing its most peaceful time in decades. A week passed, and then came October 7th. But these guys didn't miss their chance for shame even now. You can laugh, you can cry, but it's impossible to imagine in any Hollywood scenario. 5 hours before Iran's rocket attack on Israel on October 1st, on the morning of October 5th, Secretary of State Blinken published an article again in Foreign Affairs magazine, where, turning the situation upside down after a year-long war started by Iran, called for mutual fulfillment of obligations between Iran and the United States. 19th thesis: the role of the Trump administration. During the 4 years of the Trump administration, the United States completed its participation in the war against ISIS and then was not involved in any new military conflict. There were some military conflicts around the world, but it's clear that there were many fewer of them, and the number of human casualties during these 4 years was significantly lower compared to times before and after Trump. The number of terrorist attacks in Israel decreased, as did the number of victims of these attacks. The number of Ukrainians who died on the front line in Donbass fell 16 times. All this happened during Trump's presidency. 20th thesis: the role of Trump's predecessor, the Obama administration. During this period, there were 53 military conflicts. This was an explosion of violence and military activity that had not been seen for a long time and not before. It is impossible to list all these cases. I'll just name a few. Boko Haram terrorist organization actions in Nigeria, war in Côte d'Ivoire, Shia uprising in Bahrain, Libyan war, Syrian war, Iraqi war, Mali war, Central African Republic war, Mozambique war, Congo war, Ugandan war, Chadian war, Sudanese war, South Sudan war, combat operations in Malaysia and the Philippines, Rohingya genocide in Myanmar, Russian occupation of Ukrainian Crimea, Donbas war, start of the war against the Islamic State, Yemeni civil war, Houthi capture of power in Yemen, migrant invasion into Europe, launch of interracial war in the US in 2013 thanks to Obama's actions. All this happened when Obama, Biden, Harris, Burns, Sullivan, and Gordon were at the helm of the most important world police machine. As we all know, only a month separates us from that day when this same team may receive, or rather take for themselves, the mandate to continue setting our common house on fire for the next 4 years at least. If they are stopped, there will be a chance to bring the world to a more peaceful state. But this is only possible if they are not at the helm of the main world police machine. All the best to you.